This week on the Hollywood and Toto podcast, Hollywood joins the fight for free speech. Color me a tad suspicious. We talk to author James Lindsay of the new film Identity Crisis. It covers so-called gender affirming care, teens, trans, and boy, if you thought it might be explosive, it is and then some. And we explain by one of the hottest topics in Hollywood, one of the biggest stories that's out there right now. Well, you're not going to hear about it on this show. I'll explain why.
Welcome to the Hollywood and Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Hooray, Hollywood cares about free speech again. What took them so long? You know, in recent weeks, we've had actors like Sebastian Stan speak out in favor of free speech and why it's so necessary in our times. We've seen publications like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter worry about Orange Man Bad 2.0 and how he could really squelch free expression, free speech, and send a chill across the landscape. Well, great. That's wonderful. You should be on board with this. And actually, it reminded me of an era when Hollywood was all in on free speech. Remember the Bush years, the Iraq War? Well, at that time, Hollywood was all about free speech. They stood up in favor of the Dixie Chicks, who, when they criticized President Bush, they got hammered. I guess you could say they were canceled before the term even came up and was cool or hip or even just part of the culture.
I'm talking to the Dixie Chicks and they're making me feel better.
Others said, I want to speak out against Bush. I want to speak out against the war, but I am afraid I'll be punished. And one of the people who was punished to a very modest degree, but certainly to some extent, was Tim Robbins, very liberal actor. He was part of the great Bull Durham film. And when the Baseball Hall of Fame decided to honor that film's memory and legacy, well, they didn't invite him to the gala. And that was, of course, likely tied to his views about Bush and the Iraq War. He fought back. I believe the Hall of Fame eventually apologized, and as well they should. But in that moment, free speech was top of mind in Hollywood. Neil Young, the rocker who tried to cancel Joe Rogan from Spotify, he actually went on a freedom of speech tour, an actual tour dedicated to the First Amendment. Well, that was then. And in more recent years, Hollywood generally, and there are exceptions, stood down when free speech was genuinely under attack, and repeatedly so. Woke in general, cancel culture, sensitivity readers. Remember when books by Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming and Agatha Christie got tweaked and changed and censored because they were problematic? You remember that? Remember when classic sitcom episodes were memory hold, never to be seen again because they had blackface instances or even scenes that approached blackface but actually weren't really blackface at all? Yeah, that was happening quite a bit. And comedians had to watch what they say lest they be canceled or punished or shunned. There was so much going on in recent years that was just absolutely anti-First Amendment, anti-free speech. And Hollywood said, look, a squirrel. They didn't care. Again, exceptions. Rob Schneider, John Cleese, Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle to a degree. But generally speaking, Hollywood really didn't have a voice when it came to this matter. And boy, oh boy, the Hollywood press was even worse. They just laid down completely. And when they would inch up to the subject and admit what was going on, there was no outrage. There's no calls for blowback or fighting the power or, worrying about what was going on. Remember, this is the Twitter files era. This was the era where the Biden administration was saying, well, your views on COVID-19, we're going to bury them. Might even bury you on social media. It was all happening, and Hollywood just couldn't say much, if anything. But now they're back. Now it's all about free speech again. Now we're worried about what Donald Trump might do to the news, to speech in general, to protests. Now, let's be clear. I think Trump and Biden were radically different on this front. I think Trump is going to be far, far better on this front. And if President Trump does clamp down on free speech in some way, I imagine most, if not all, conservatives would rally against it. I know I will. But why the change of heart, Hollywood? What was different about then and now? Well, obviously, it's partisanship. If you're a conservative and you get canceled, if you get punished, if you get silenced, Hollywood by and large doesn't care. They just don't. But if a liberal is silenced, if an argument that's progressive is under fire, well, all of a sudden, it's battle stations. That's what we've watched over the last 10, 20 years, maybe even a little more. It couldn't be more obvious. So to Hollywood, I say, well, bravo, welcome to the fight. We welcome you. We want you to be part of the free speech army because it does matter so significantly. But you know what? If we find you a tad suspicious in your intentions, that's not on us. That's on you. Well, let's talk about a documentary that covers the most explosive issue imaginable. What could go wrong? Talking about so-called gender affirming care, trans youth, trans surgeries. Yeah. Try to have a polite conversation about that topic at your next dinner invite. It's not going to happen, most likely. You might go home a little bit early. Maybe your host will send you out the door. It's just that incendiary. So along comes a new documentary from the Turning Point USA team and also the DailyWire. It's called Identity Crisis, and it's highly critical of trans surgeries, of gender affirming care, of this whole industry. No punches pulled. And yeah, there are some trigger warnings in the film, and they are, I think, pretty necessary. You have to watch it to understand it. But boy, I'm no fan of trigger warnings, but once in a while, it does make sense, exactly like it does in this film.
When it stopped being a thing for adults and it started to be a, let's teach this to kids.
Total lie, manipulation, it's gaslighting.
Please stop. He's a boy, not a girl. How could she do this to my son?
Which is why I wanted to have on one of the members of the film to talk about it. And before I go there and introduce my next guest, James Lindsay, I wanted to give the boilerplate reaction, what I'm supposed to say. But it's also in my heart. I have no hatred for trans people. I can't imagine the heartache they feel, feeling trapped in what they think is the wrong body. My heart bleeds for them. It's a terrible situation. And I don't know the answers. I'm just a pop culture critic. I'm not a surgeon. I'm not a doctor. But I see some things within the culture which just strike me as wrong. And I think we should be having a conversation about this. And it shouldn't be one-sided. And I think a lot of times pop culture in general shuts this out entirely. How many mainstream documentaries take a contrarian view to gender affirming care? I can count them all in one hand. It's none. There are no mainstream documentaries covering this topic, of course. So it falls on the hands of the Daily Wire and Turning Point USA to make it happen. So our guest this week is James Lindsay. He's an author, he's an activist, and if you don't know him, maybe just Google grievance studies hoax. It's a barn burner. He really did expose the folly that is DEI-style woke agendas. It's
You know, you think, oh, these people are studying racism and sexism. Okay, somebody should be doing that and good. Then you start looking at it and they publish some crazy stuff. I mean, crazy stuff.
The new documentary lets detransitioners speak. It hears their stories. It hears their arguments. It hears their pain. We also meet a dad who essentially lost his son at the age of 2. Yes, the child was transitioned at the age of 2 to be a girl. It's powerful. It's heartbreaking. And it's a key part of this documentary. Now, even exploring this subject and having this show on YouTube is problematic. Could it be censored? Possibly. But imagine that. This isn't a crazed documentary. These are sane, sensible people having real arguments and having true discussions on a really important subject. It should be out there. It should be available. And for a limited time, it will be on X. It can be seen through the 13th of January on X, and then it's going to go behind the paywall at Daily Wire Plus. So here's my conversation with James Lindsay. And it is a conversation, and you can agree and you can disagree, but let's have that talk. Let's hear the arguments. Let's have more documentaries like this. As Andrew Breitbart famously said, more voices, not less. I worked at Breitbart for a while. I worked under Andrew for a while. a short while, sadly, before he died. That might be his biggest legacy. More voices, not less. And James Lindsay is one of those voices that deserves to be heard. Well, James, thanks for joining the show. I know some of the work that you do. I know this is near and dear to your heart, this subject. But when you're approached to be a part of a project like Identity Crisis, obviously they've got to win you over. You've got to have faith in the project. It's going to be heading in the proper direction. It's going to have the gravitas. I'm kind of curious what won you over. What was the information that you were given that you said, hey, yeah, I want to be a part of this. I want my name associated with it. I want to be a full investor in this particular project.
Yeah, two things really. The first is actually just the imprimatur of the Turning Point USA brand. So I've had a great relationship with Turning Point over the last, 4 years, I guess, the end of 2020. And I met Charlie Kirk a little bit before that. So I've had a wonderful relationship with Turning Point. I'm happy to jump in and help their projects. They said that they were going to be making this documentary, and it's about the transition issue, and they're going to be talking to a lot of detransitioners. And I thought, well, I think this is an incredibly important issue. As a matter of fact, I think it is arguably history's greatest child abuse scandal, if not all of history, certainly modern Western history's greatest child abuse scandal, with no question. So anything that I could do, and I do have some expertise on the issue, to lend to that film, I wanted to do. And the second part of that would be actually what I already mentioned, the detransitioner involvement. I've been advocating for basically as long as I knew detransitioners exist, that their voices are incredibly important. There's a young woman I met some years ago who was an activist who stepped away now. She's not in the film. Her name's Helena Kirshner, but she and I got to know each other a little bit, and her story was extremely compelling. Eventually, I find out about Chloe Cole, who is a part of this documentary, and I get to meet, Laura Becker and some of these others. And I find their stories so incredibly important to tell about how, almost with one voice, they say they feel like they were pulled into a cult-like mindset. And the consequences are permanent physical and mental, frankly, mutilation. And so, when I heard that Turning Point was doing a documentary, and moreover, that it was aiming to elevate not just this issue, but also the detransitioners themselves, I wanted to be a part of it.
The detransitioners, I don't know where you hear their stories. I know social media, obviously X, has been super helpful in that regard, but I can't imagine they ever get a close-up on the news. They're not profiled by magazines. And I think that's one of the many reasons why this is such an important documentary. Talk about that, sort of the blackout, if you will, of their voices. I mean, even if you were pro gender affirming care, as it's often called, you would want their side of the story to be heard, I would think. I mean, they're humans too. They've suffered. They've got an opinion. They've got a perspective, but you don't hear them, do you?
No, that's right. And so that's, again, why a documentary like this is so important. And there are a handful of others out there as well, but to get those stories out, because you say, you don't know where I would have heard such a story. Like I said, I'm actually ran into this Helena woman online, and she was, trying to do advocacy and speak up. And a friend of mine had started to talk to her and learn more about her. And she reached out to me, and we just kind of, talked and built like a distant online friendship a little bit, and so I got to hear her story from her through equivalent to text messages. But then Chloe, when I first heard her story, I was aware of her, but I hadn't heard her story. Actually, the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. had put together a tackling gender ideology summit, a closed door private summit, invite only, and I was asked to come. And Chloe gave her full testimony on stage in front of the 100 or so of us there. And this is, I guess, 3 years ago. And just everybody in the room, it's like you ripped our hearts out. Like everybody's crying, like every mom in the room, and there were a lot of moms, go running up afterwards to hug her. And I was like, just moved hearing it. And then the bad part is, by that point, I had learned enough about the issue to where I'm sitting there with this odd feeling. Like, Chloe's story is horrible, and everybody's crying, everybody's upset, everybody's moved by it. And then I'm like, hers is one of the mild ones. They're far worse. Many of them are far worse stories. But like you said, they are silenced. Back a long time ago, much to kind of my chagrin and embarrassment now, I got involved for a few years, a little over a decade ago, with what was called the New Atheist Movement. Not a particularly cool point in my history, but it is what it is. And within that was primarily ex-Christians. who were speaking up and angry at church for whatever reasons. And there was a contingent, however, and this is why I bring it up, there were a contingent of ex-Muslims who were part of this as well. And they got attacked by everybody. Their stories were absolutely not allowed to be told. They were referred to as the minority within the minority. And I only bring that up because the detransitioners are like the minority within the minority. There's not very many trans people in the world. And then there are fewer who go on and detransition. And they are absolutely, they're what some of the, critical theory literature refers to as a submerged people. Their stories are just kept quiet. Nobody wants to hear what they have to say. Their mainstream outlets tend to avoid embracing them because the whole thing is weird and dark. And then on, broadly speaking, the left or the gender ideology embracing part of the culture, the gender affirming part of the culture doesn't want to hear it. It greatly upsets their views. So I think, again, that's just another reason it's so important that something like this is being made and being done and showing people not just their stories, but everything that kind of goes in and is behind this kind of horrifying medical scandal that we're all staring at.
When you think of, I know that you are well versed in this material, you've been studying it, you've been looking into it, you've been meeting people, yet there's a lot of the film that shocked me and that I was not aware of, and I don't have the depth of knowledge you have. Were there things in the film when you saw the finished product where you thought, wow, I didn't know that, or things that shocked even you as someone who understands this subject so well?
The answer is yes and no. As far as the subject, there was nothing that surprised me. I've been studying this in some level of depth. So I published a book in 2020, which was during the pandemic, which therefore meant it was delayed because COVID made us run out of paper somehow, something. So I had written a chapter about queer theory from which all of this issue derives in 2018 in a book called Cynical Theories. So, many years before I'd been studying this and it was aware of it. So on the, I guess, theoretical side, very little shocked me. Some of the stories are heart-wrenching. The story Adam Vina tells, his loving dad who has his child weaponized against him in the state of California, takes his son away. That's gut-wrenching. And there is a surprising element to that, right? That the state, it's like it's happening, but you don't until you see it and hear it happening. But honestly, it's like, I hate to do this with the trigger warning, the surgeries, the images of the surgeries is literally overwhelming. I sat there in tremendous discomfort watching that and thinking, my God, people need to see this.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a good use of a trigger warning. If there's ever been one, I think that's really appropriate. One of the things about the film I thought was interesting too, is Buck Angel is a trans man, and he's in the story. He's critical of this approach to children as well. I mean, I thought that was a really vital thing, because I think it's easy to say, oh, you just hate people who are trans and people who have gender dysphoria. And I think having him as such an integral part of the film mattered. What was your take on that?
Well, it's crucial actually to I want to figure out the right way to phrase this, but to humanize the side that's saying no to this, right? Mm-hmm. Because the mainstream press, the kind of prevailing dialogue has been that if you speak up about this, you must be motivated by anti-LGBTQ hate, is what they call it. Yeah. For speaking up for this for myself, I have this malicious profile that the Southern Poverty Law Center put out about me that's mostly not even true. I think it's actually somewhat hilarious, but that's a significant and kind of serious thing. So it's difficult. The belief, I was just at, again, the same Heritage Foundation annual summit. We just left that, and we were actually talking about how on the broadly to speak the left, you're simply not allowed to believe that conservatives and kind of mainstream normie people in the middle are motivated by care and concern for the children, that this is a love and compassion and protect children, not political. It is not a political issue. There are children who are being subjected to psychological and then medical interventions that are abusive all the way through. And we are actually motivated by the protection of children. Well, it turns out that when you take somebody like Buck and have that role in the film, you lose a lot of the ability to claim that this is motivated by some bigotry or some anti-somebody or anti-people ideology, which it certainly is not. There are people, there's, Buck Angel and others speak out who are in the trans category, but there's also Gays Against Groomers has been speaking out against this issue. So tying the LGB to the T in the Q is not, that gets dispelled by their representation on this issue. So I think it's actually very important to have those voices and to hear this isn't a bigotry thing, that this isn't what motivates us to do this.
Yeah, I mean, the tone of the film is very serious, very somber, but also just brimming with empathy. I want to circle back to something, before the chat, I knew about your work, but I want to just Google and get a little more information. And I did glance at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I even looked at the Wikipedia page for you, and then I quickly clicked away because I could see where it was going. And a farcical description of what you do. But you're so good at, and it's kind of a weird thing to even say, at sticking your neck out, of being risky, of saying things that can have consequences. Obviously, you continue to do it. You understand it's important, and that's all the credit to you. What are some of the really bad things that have happened to you because you've been outspoken on issues where there's only a certain perspective that is allowed? I mean, I don't want to get too dark and dreary.
No, it's fine.
I mean, I in a way, if you have a different perspective, it should be okay, and people can disagree with you and say you're wrong. But
right.
It doesn't stop there. It goes further. There are now pages about you on the web where they're disparaging you unfairly. Have there been worse things? I mean, I just want to know what happens when you.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned, with Wikipedia and with Southern Poverty Law Center and so on, there's kind of this whole mythology about me that's not real. It's kind of interesting. I feel like I meet a new version of me, about once a week on the internet, where somebody has described me in rather tremendous detail, and I don't recognize the person they've described in the slightest. So there's a lot of that. So, of course, that becomes real here and there. Somebody will say, well, I read this about you. And so is it true? Or even worse, they just assume that it is because it's written. I was kicked off of Twitter for 5 months for attacking or taking on, I should say, this particular issue. So when Elon Musk bought Twitter, he let me back on, but I had been permanently removed. I've been permanently removed from Facebook as well for standing up for these things. I have more recently been doxxed. So my personal private information has been spread across the internet, along with very large amounts of malicious rumors about my family. People have hunted down members in my family and harassed them. So yeah, these things are very serious. They threaten threats to our livelihoods, threats to our safety, had to get law enforcement involved with some of it. So yeah, some of it has been pretty ugly, but my mom raised me. I know it sounds really silly. My mom raised me with the following brilliant motherly aphorism: right is right and wrong is wrong, which, biblically, the way it's phrased is in the book of James, chapter 4:17, which is one of my favorite Bible verses, which is, for he who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, it is a sin. Yeah. And so there are right things to do. There are things to speak up about and not to worry about the consequences. Daniel Penny was right to defend that train car full of people from Jordan Neely and to face the consequences, even in that twisted justice system, if we can use that phrase for it, in New York City. The right thing has to be done.
Yeah. And I think just a quick end note to that part of the conversation is, I think when you're the good guys, you don't react that way. You don't behave that way. You don't respond that way. So I think that maybe, even if you just take away all the details of the conversation, of the argument, I think that's rather telling.
That's like the whole allegory of Lord of the Rings, right? Don't take the evil ring and use it.
When you think about documentaries, there are so many made each year. A lot of them are well-intentioned. A lot of them touch on really powerful issues, and a lot just don't break through the zeitgeist. They just either get ignored, they don't get seen enough. It's just the way documentaries are, and the way there's such a crush of content in our lives. But sometimes they peek through. I mean, even no matter what you think about climate change, Inconvenient Truth really rocked the culture. And I think the same is true with What is a Woman? Can you talk about this film's potential in that arena? I mean, it's going to be on X. Anyone can check it out. And of course, they can also see it on DailyWire Plus, which we'll talk about more at the very end. But what is the potential here? Because for every documentary that slips through the cracks, there's one that shakes people by the scruff of their neck.
Yeah, I hope the potential is as big as it deserves to be, given the importance of the issue. So I hope people will see it and then feel compelled to share it. That people a lot of times ask me, I travel the world speaking, and they ask me, well, what can I do? I'm just a mom, or I'm just a school teacher, or whatever. And even if all you can do is share quality materials, it makes a huge difference. Um, I think this has a lot of potential. Even just having been a Turning Point USA production, I thought it was going to have a lot of potential. And then, excitingly, I just found out at America Fest, they didn't tell me ahead of time even, that they'd partnered with DailyWire. DailyWire has tremendous reach. Obviously, that's where What Is a Woman came from with Matt Walsh. And so they have tremendous reach, and it's going to be able to piggyback now off of the blockbuster status of What Is a Woman.
Mhm.
So hopefully it will have that ability to penetrate. The content, as you kind of indicated, the content is such that if it does, it will shake the people who see it the same way. Again, agree or disagree with the issue, the way that Inconvenient Truth did, or Blackfish, which was about the abuses at SeaWorld, which was a literally world-changing documentary a lot of people saw. Another one is The Creepy Line, that was about how Google executives said they go right up to the creepy line of spying on people, whatever that means. And that was a eye-opening documentary. This, I think, has similar potential, but I have to give credit to the Turning Point's crew for making it and doing so well with it as they did. But the Daily Wire is like rocket fuel underneath it. So I'm so excited to see that's how that's just going to come out.
I think there are certain subjects which should not be even remotely political, and they are. I think, sadly, free speech has become in that arena where it seems like it's often a left right. Of course, there's examples, the Bill Maher's of the world, the Ricky Gervaises. I mean, you see crossover, which is obviously wonderful, but this feels like a even more heavily politicized issue where it really shouldn't be. Do you see signs that that's changing?
Yeah, this was the number one, according to polling, the number one issue that motivated new Trump voters in the 2024 election. So there is a lot of, as you might say, cross the aisle concern about this, where you see it polled even in states like California. You see north of 70% of the population very concerned about this issue. And that's a state that's roughly 2-to-1 Democrat. And so if you're getting 70%, 80% buy-in on concern about this issue, this is extremely cross-partisan. More than that, also, although this is polarizing in its own way now, this is an issue that has physically touched Elon Musk's life, as he's been public about. And with it being an exclusive release on X, and then it having been an issue close to Elon Musk, he has 280 or 50 or whatever million followers on X, whatever the huge number. I think he has the largest account, obviously, and that's going to give it a high probability of getting a lot of reach. And Elon is an interesting character. I mean, obviously he aligned with Trump in the lead up to the election, but for years, he's the electric car guy. He's building rocket ships. It's like he appeals to a very wide range of people for different reasons. And this his connection to this issue is personal, not political, and therefore his endorsement, if that comes, might make a huge difference.
The one thing I think that might be missing in this conversation from a pop culture lens, which is where I cover, is a fictional film, or maybe even a fact-based movie, like a narrative feature. And I think about Adam, the dad in this film, who's, I mean, if you're not touched by his story, you just don't have a heart. Is that the next step? And not to besmirch a documentary is wonderful things. And I think this one, will get the message out. But I would think that a feature film with these themes would really potentially rock the pop culture world. But, obviously Hollywood's not going to make it. Do you see that there's potential with other, there's Angel Studios, there's Daily Wire, even for them, it may be tricky to make this kind of movie, but I would think that might be the ultimate goal, to get a story like that in theaters, where you've got famous actors and you've got dramatic turns, and it's a different beast in a way. What are your thoughts on that kind of project?
I think you're onto something with that. I mean, I can't say what it would do, but the left has understood for a very long time that art moves culture, and like art speaks on a different level. All of this information, this nerdy stuff, this, I hate the meme, but the left brain stuff does what it does. But when you can create, that story, that narrative, that compelling drama, something really amazing is possible. So, for example, you mentioned Angel Studios, and of course, DailyWire has this capacity as well. But you mentioned Angel Studios, and last year they put out a film called Cabrini, and they asked me if I would come see this premiere for it with them, and I went to see it, and I thought, what am I watching? A Catholic movie about a nun, and I left like screaming, like, this is the best film I've seen in a decade. This is amazing. It's telling this story of this woman and her struggle and her challenge, who goes on to become the first saint of the American experience. And so it's a very interesting film that, the underlying thing here is, how are you going to make a movie about Catholicism that doesn't just fall into the tropes of like the creepy priest or the weird priest, but they were able to fully move and humanize without shying away from, the ugly politics of the Vatican, which can be a thing sometimes. And, the ugly politics of race in New York City at the turn of the 19th century. So they were able to make this film and move that story. And so something like that could definitely happen here, whether it's I think there's a film, I'm not 100% sure, that's sort of like this. It's not fictional because it's about Chloe Cole, but something like this, it tells the story of a dad like Adam, or like a detransitioner like Chloe or Laura, would be a huge potential game changer if it has that artistic quality. My line for that is, when I left Cabrini, I think the first thing I said to Matt Faraci from Angel Studios was, this isn't a movie, it's a film. And so if it crosses that line, it would, I think, be a tremendous gift.
Yeah. One quick note before we sign off. If that kind of movie actually were to be made, the fight against its release would be profound. I've covered this area for quite some time. We've seen the battles for movies like Unplanned and other films that were maybe pro-abortion, anti-abortion. That would be kids' play compared to what they would try to do with this film. But it also, you can't stop it sometimes as well. And I would like that kind of story to be made. But James, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, to share more stories about this film. Of course, it's Identity Crisis. It is available on X January 10th through the 13th. And then it's going to go behind the paywall at DailyWire Plus. Check it out, either venue. Obviously, there's tons of great information and content at DailyWire Plus. So it's always a good time to check out them and subscribe. But this weekend is your chance to see it. And I think a lot of people will be very curious about it. And I think a lot of people will be touched, if not dismayed, if not outraged, and maybe some minds will be changed. But again, thanks so much, James.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for trying to get the word out about this. I think it's an incredibly important film. It's an incredibly important set of stories that people need to have in their head to understand this issue. 9 times out of 10, when we talk to somebody who's, out on the street, so to speak, a man on the street, and you tell them what's really happening, they don't believe you. And then when you tell them and show them that it's really happening, within 30 seconds, they're shocked. And within 5 minutes, they're now an activist against this horror. So this movie is a big deal.
Yeah, this perspective needs to be out there, even if you've never heard of it before. So that may be the case in sometimes, but thanks again.
Yep, thank you.
Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, got your attention? I'm not talking to you, dear listener. I'm actually talking to the Google gods, the folks who are behind the algorithms. I want more downloads on this episode. I kid a little bit, but I do refer to the fact that this is an ongoing story. It's a hot button story, probably the hottest pop culture narrative around that doesn't involve Taylor Swift. Now, if you don't know, these are 2 actors who were in the movie It Ends With Us, which was a very popular film last year. Matter of fact, one of the very rare blockbusters that wasn't a prequel or a sequel or a remake. Big hit. And then all heck broke loose. Now, of course, we've got dueling lawsuits involving the major players. It's the ultimate he said, she said, and it's ugly, and it's getting uglier. And you really haven't heard much about it at all in this show. I haven't been reporting on it that much at all at HollywoodInToto.com. And I want to share why. It's actually rather simple. Don't like hot takes. Never did, never will. And I don't know how to approach this story. Every new day, there seems like there's a new revelation that makes one party look terrible and the other party look innocent. Then you wait a couple news cycles later and it flips. I also don't trust the media when it comes to covering stories like this, or even anything at this point. The media has been so corrupt and so crooked, you don't know what axe they have to grind at any given moment. So I could explore this more. I could get some clicks for it, possibly, but I just don't know what I could add to the conversation as of yet. I have some thoughts about the media, about victimhood status, about the Me Too movement and how it collapsed based on partisanship, but I'm not quite there yet. I want to find out more. And I do think this is an important story. This isn't just gossip and behind the scenes mania in Hollywood. It's actually more than that. And I just hope that we get more facts, more obvious information that we could look on and make our own decisions on the subject. But I want this show to be about what I can add to the conversation, what wisdom I can share, having covered Hollywood for 20 plus years. And I think I've got some to share. But here on this subject, at this point, I really have nothing to share. But I wanted to let you know why I haven't explored it and why I've been holding back, at least for now. I think sometimes what we say on air, at a website, is actually important, but it's also important what we don't say. I think one of the main examples of media bias are the stories that aren't covered. And so I wanted to be more transparent about what's going on with this show and why you haven't heard about it here, at least not yet. Maybe this is my way of threading the needle, but I also wanted to be transparent about the show and how we approach topics. So let's keep listening to the news. Let's keep hearing the updates, and maybe we'll get a clearer picture of this particular scandal. But for now, I'm just going to hold my fire. Well, that's it for the show this week. Thank you to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup, including one of my favorite shows, Chicks on the Right, Mock and Daisy. They are the best. If you're not listening to them, shame on you. Get on that. Go download the show and follow it. Of course, it is 2025. More video segments are coming your way. And if you haven't checked out my short on Hollywood series, I hope you do. It is under a minute, and it looks at Hollywood with a little bit of snark, certainly from a right-of-center perspective. You don't get that too often. And I employ my son, who helps produce those segments. So if you like those pop-up visuals, the little sound cues, it's all on him. The jokes are mine, give or take, for better or worse. Comedian Jim Gaffigan admits some fans will not forgive him for his anti-Trump rants. Others cite his Hot Pocket propaganda. Kathy Griffin predicts that Trump will send her to an internment camp. Trump confirmed the prediction, saying all inmates must watch My Life on the D-List 24/7. So I hope you enjoy Short on Hollywood. I hope you come back next week. And again, I thank you for listening.